This video is a continuation of the evolution videos. We're going to talk a bit more about natural selection, gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, and a bit about inbreeding, artificial selection, and that sort of thing. So there's a few hypotheses put forward around how evolution occurs and how change occurs within evolution and how quickly this happens. So the first hypothesis is about gradualism. This puts forward that species evolve gradually by small changes over long periods of time. So there's just gradual changes in the genetic makeup, in the genotype, and in the phenotype, in the physical characteristics of an organism. This is the hypothesis that Darwin put forward in his book, The Origin of Species. So what he was saying is that we started with an original organism, and over time, there was a slow, gradual change. So you can see that we started with this organism. It slowly changed into a more orange butterfly like this, or into a white and brown butterfly like this one. And here is where speciation occurred. So these are now two separate species from one common ancestor. You can see that time and evolution, evolution's occurring at a slow rate and at a constant rate. So species are forming at a constant rate and changes are occurring constantly but slowly. So then the second hypothesis is punctuated equilibrium. So Stephen Jay Gould put this hypothesis forward. What he said is that evolution is not gradual, but it happens where there's a period of sudden rapid change and then a period of very little change. So what he said is he studied the fossil links and he found long periods of time where species didn't change or they changed very little. This is the equilibrium part of punctuated equilibrium. And then within these long periods of time, there was some very short periods of time where there was quite a lot of change. So it was punctuated by short periods of time with a lot of change. And what supports this hypothesis is that we don't have a lot of traditional fossils. We don't have a lot of fossils like the missing link fossils, so these in-between fossils. What we often find is a fossil like this butterfly and then a fossil like these two resultant butterflies. We don't have these in-between fossils that support the fact that evolution is happening slowly. We have the fossils that support this one, and then suddenly there's a change, and just like that, we have a new species. Obviously, it's not just like that as in over one generation, still many generations, but much faster than as in gradualism. So we would usually accept Gould's hypothesis as the more correct one. So punctuated equilibrium shows that phenotypic modifications, so modifications in the physical characteristics, they occur where the species first branch off from the parent species, so from the ancestor species, and then after that they change very little. So after that, once the environment is stable, there's very little change. And you can see here that evolution occurs rapidly, and then there's very little evolution. Rapid evolution, very little. And as during this period of rapid evolution, that's when speciation mostly occurs. So we can see here in the phylogenetic tree that each time there's a branch off, that would be a new species. So this is a common ancestor forming new species. And usually this speciation would occur when the environment changes. So we'd have rapid phenotypic modifications, a lot of phenotypic modifications when the environment has changed. And then when it stays still, it usually means the environment is quite stable. So obviously there is a period of gradualism because you're not going to go from one species immediately within a generation to a new species, but it's a lot shorter period of gradualism than Darwin thought. So it's only it's still a lot of generations, but much fewer than the millions and millions of years that Darwin suggested. So then if we look at natural selection, and we're going to compare it later to artificial selection, it's really important to know the process of natural selection and the important parts about it. So natural selection is the mechanism of evolution where nature selects the fittest individual for survival. So that's what we often call survival of the fittest, adapt or die, that sort of thing. During natural selection, it's the process whereby individuals that are best adapted to the environment, they're the ones that will survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. Those that are not as well adapted to the environment tend to usually die out. It's very important to note that natural selection occurs within a population and not in an individual. And we can see that because within a population, there's some individuals that are well adapted and others that are not as well adapted to the environment. And we can just see here by this little cartoon, there's giraffes. There's variation in the population in terms of height. Obviously, the giraffes that can reach the trees are more likely to survive. They're better adapted to the environment. And the short little giraffe, unfortunately, can't reach the tree, so he dies. So he's not very well adapted because he can't get access to the resources, which is the food. Because he can't get food, he's not likely to survive, so he wouldn't reproduce. Those that do have access to food and they're better adapted, they're more likely to survive and to reproduce and therefore to pass on their genes to the next generation. So the best definition to learn of natural selection would be natural selection is a process by which nature or the environment selects for survival those individuals that are best adapted to the environmental conditions and as a result will produce the most offspring. So there's a few conditions that natural selection requires. Without it, natural selection won't happen. These are some conditions that mostly Darwin was the one who suggested. So he said that there must be variation in the organisms of a population. So as we see here, there has to be a variation, in this case in height, but obviously in whatever characteristic we're focusing on. It's best to have a large gene pool for this because obviously the larger the gene pool, the more the variation there is. Another condition is that the characteristics responsible for variation must be hereditary. So they must be able to be passed on to the next generation. There must be more offspring produced than are necessary for survival of the population. So even if only one individual is needed to survive to sexual maturity, even if the survival rate is like 90%, so 9 out of 10 individuals produced will survive to sexual maturity, it's better to produce, or the offspring produced must be around, say, 15. So what that's saying is the organism needs to produce more offspring than necessary for survival because they know that some are going to die out. And the last thing is that there must be changes in the environment. If the environment is constantly exactly the same, it's stable, it's never changing, the organisms won't need to adapt because they already will be able to survive in the environment. But if it changes, that means that there's going to be some sort of phenotypic a characteristic that supports some organisms' survival and doesn't support others and leads to the death of others. So there needs to be changes in the environment. Certain environmental factors exert pressure on the population and serve as a trigger for natural selection. They're known as selective pressures, and it leads to successful adaptation or to extinction of the population. So some selective pressures could be competition for food, water, space, for mating partners. There could be predation, change in temperature, diseases, limited light, oxygen, or water. So if we just look at an example of this, if we look at the giraffes, the selective pressure would be the competition for food, where only the tall individuals can reach the food. Those who are shorter can't reach the food, so they're less adapted. And so that would lead to extinction of the shorter individuals. But those who are tall, they have been successfully adapted to the population. One of the best examples of natural selection would be the peppered moth. So there's light and dark variants of the moth. Before the Industrial Revolution in England, the most common form of the moth was light grey to resemble the lichens on trees and to camouflage into the trees to avoid predators and stuff. But then when the Industrial Revolution occurred, there became a much more common form of the black moth because this resembled the suit and allowed them to camouflage within the black environment and protect them from predators. So those with the black coloring were actually better adapted during the Industrial Revolution. And now in the modern era, we have a lot less soot and stuff. So the most common form is back again to becoming the light grey. So we can see that these moths are adapting to the environment and evolving, where they started with a common form of light grey, then black, and then light grey, depending on the environment and the constantly changing environment. So this flow diagram is really, really important. They probably wouldn't ask you the entire diagram, but they may ask you a few steps of it relating to natural selection. So if we look at the example of caterpillars, hairy and non-hairy caterpillars, looking at natural selection, organisms produce a large number of offspring. That's usually the first step in your flow diagram. There's a lot of variation among the offspring. Obviously, we know that that's a requirement for natural selection. And as I said, natural selection always acts on variation. So the variation could be some caterpillars are hairy and some are non-hairy. We then have a change in the environmental conditions. Or there would be competition within the environment. And that means that there's a struggle for survival. Some will survive and some won't. In this case, our environmental pressure could be a new predator, and this predator only eats non-hairy caterpillars. That means that some offspring will have a favorable trait that allows them to adapt to the changed environment, and these ones are more likely to survive. So those with the favorable trait would be the hairy caterpillars that aren't really going to be eaten by the predators. Organisms without the favorable traits are less able to adapt and they will die. So those would be the non-hairy caterpillars. They can't adapt to this arrival of the new predator and they will be eaten by the predator. The organisms that survive will reproduce and they'll pass on the favorable trait to their offspring. That's because pretty much the only organisms that survive are those with the favorable trait. So they'll pass it on to the next generation. Next generation will have a higher proportion of individuals with the favorable trait because there's a higher proportion of individuals of the previous generation that survived with the favorable trait. Therefore, they're more likely to pass it on. And this process will continue until eventually all the individuals in the population have this favorable trait and evolution by natural selection will have taken place. So in our caterpillar example, eventually all the caterpillars will have become hairy. By accumulating this and other small changes in the population, a new species may arise. It doesn't always have to, but if there's enough changes, it could occur. One thing to note in terms of terminology, when we talk about natural selection and humans, when humans are not involved, we talk about a favorable trait. So the hairiness of caterpillars, it's a favorable trait. If we talk about humans and artificial selection, genetic engineering, where humans actually choose to reproduce organisms with traits that they want to see in the offspring, we talk about a desirable trait. So if humans select the trait, it's the desirable trait. If nature selects the trait, so if the selective pressure selects the trait, we say it's a favorable trait. Is natural selection random? Definitely not. So the way that variations arise, so how organisms get to be hairy or non-hairy and so on, that's definitely random. That comes through mutation and recombination of genes during sexual reproduction. Those are 100% random. But the process of natural selection in itself is not random because the organisms selected for survival are those that are better adapted to the environment. The environment doesn't just choose random organisms to survive, it chooses the ones that are best adapted. Does natural selection result in perfection? Obviously not. No population and no organism is perfectly adapted. Are we humans perfectly adapted to our environment? No, you can see we're not. There's still a lot of death, disease, people who aren't well adapted, and so on. But natural selection is continually occurring. So if we just look at some questions, Darwin's 4 key observations that helped him to develop his theory of natural selection are the changes within an environment, there must be variation within a population, more offspring than necessary must be produced, and this favorable trait needs to be hereditary. Type of characteristics does nature select during evolution? The favorable trait, the favorable characteristic. In nature, there's always a struggle for existence because of competition, predation, adverse climatic conditions, etc. A collective term for these factors is selective pressure. Why is the concept of natural selection so important? It's adapt or die, so it drives evolution. It makes sure that the fittest individuals survive, the best adapted individuals survive. And why is natural selection not a random process? Well, we answered it here. If we then look at artificial selection, this would be the deliberate breeding of plants and animals for desired characteristics. that would not necessarily benefit the survival of the offspring. So it doesn't necessarily benefit the survival of the offspring, but it benefits humans who choose the desirable characteristic. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be detrimental to the offspring, but we're just saying that they don't have to be good for the offspring. So humans select these desired characteristics. So humans would be the environmental trigger. Humans are the selective pressure. We also call artificial selection selective breeding or unnatural selection. So what happens during artificial selection is that a specific organism, whether it be plant or animal, is chosen for a specific genetic trait, so this desirable trait that's required by the breeder. The organism is then bred with another organism of the same species with the same characteristics. Based on genetic mechanisms, more offspring will have the desirable characteristic because both parents have it. And this process can be repeated again and again until all the offspring have the desired characteristic. So some of the difference between natural and artificial selection, they'll often ask this sort of question in like a table format saying, describe some of the differences. So it's quite important to know. In natural selection, the environment is the selective pressure, but in humans act as a selective pressure. They determine which traits are selected. In natural selection, the selected characteristics are advantageous for survival in the natural environment. So it will benefit the survival of the offspring. It's a favorable trait. In artificial selection, the selected characteristics are not necessarily advantageous for survival in the natural environment. It's not a favorable trait, it's just a desirable trait for humans. And natural selection obviously maintains variation, allowing for evolution, but artificial selection decreases variation because only the same offsprings are bred again and again and again, so that only the one characteristic is present, and there's less variation in the characteristics. And obviously this is less evolution. You can have a look at this table again. One of the other important things to note is that artificial selection happens a lot faster because humans do the breeding and the reproduction or cause the reproduction, whereas natural selection occurs a lot slower. Some of the similarities between natural and artificial selection, obviously that there has to be variation within the particular population, that the variation is hereditary, and the outcome between natural and artificial selection is the same, changes over time in the population, and certain characteristics, these either favorable or desirable characteristics, become more frequent. So if we look at crop plants, obviously crop plants have been selected by artificial selection. If we look at the plant reproduction video that I put out a few weeks ago, we can see that we started with plants that look very different to the plants we've now domesticated and use and grow today. And that mostly happened through artificial selection. So you can look at the teosine plant, which was an example of a plant that underwent artificial selection. We also do artificial selection in dogs, in dog breeding. You can read through this and see that some of the traits selected for would be firstly hunting, the guarding, racing, herding, and initially some of the traits selected for would be tameness, playfulness, etc. And the initial ancestor of the dog would be the grey wolf. One of the things to note is that dogs have actually 78 chromosomes, 39 pairs of chromosomes. We know that we have 23 pairs, so 36 chromosomes overall. Just because dogs have more chromosomes doesn't mean they're more complex than us. You can read through this and just see why purebreds, so why inbreeding and artificial selection within dogs is not always desirable for the dogs themselves, doesn't always benefit the survival of the dogs. So inbreeding, we know, is mating of genetically similar individuals. So it will result in homozygosity. So these individuals, usually the traits that they share will be passed on until eventually the offspring only contain the traits for the desirable characteristics and the characteristics that their offspring, that their ancestors shared. There will be much less variation in the population after inbreeding. Inbreeding prevents evolution because there's less genetic variation, and also because there's a high risk of recessive disorders. So if organisms that are genetically similar, and if, let's say they are both heterozygous individuals, if they now are inbred due to artificial selection, there may be offspring that are now homozygous recessive, and often there's recessive disorders or disorders that only are exhibited in those organisms that are homozygous recessive, which would obviously often lead to premature death and therefore less reproduction, so there would be less evolution. Inbreeding in humans could lead to something like hemophilia, which we see in the royal family, Tay-Sachs disease, and when cousins or siblings marry, obviously that's an example of inbreeding as well, because these organisms are obviously genetically similar if you're cousins or siblings. So we can see that in the royal family, hemophilia is quite a common recessive disorder. In a normal population, hemophilia is quite rare because obviously it's recessive. But within the royal family, where there are already genetically similar individuals, hemophilia has become a lot more common. And then outbreeding obviously would be the opposite of inbreeding, and outbreeding would be the mating between individuals that are not closely related, so they're not genetically similar. It results in a new breed of organisms. Obviously, it doesn't result in a new species of organisms, because this mating between individuals needs to be between individuals of the same species. Over time, it can lead to a formation of a new species due to natural selection and evolution, but within 1 or 2 generations, it would just result in a new breed, a new variant almost. Some of the advantages of outbreeding would be an increase in heterozygosity, so an increase in variation, increase in the size of the gene pool because new genes are constantly introduced. There's a strong evolutionary potential, so more likely for evolution to occur, and this results in the species being a lot more successful in the long term because they're more likely to be adapted. And it sharply reduces the risk of deleterious recessive genes, so any recessive disorders being expressed. Obviously, these recessive disorders may still be present in the population, but the organisms are more likely to be heterozygous than to be homozygous recessive. Some of the disadvantages of outbreeding is that it can destroy well-adapted genotypes. So if one population is very well adapted to a specific environment, even if it's a small population with very little variation, the little amount of variation could mean that all the organisms are well adapted. So there's very few non-well adapted organisms. And if we then look at outbreeding and, for example, mix that population with a population of the same species from a very different environment, so with a lot of variation between the populations, this could destroy the well-adapted genotypes and mean that that initial population that was quite well adapted has now got genes introduced that are that make the phenotype less well adapted. So that could be a disadvantage. But in general, outbreeding is usually more beneficial than not.